Kansas will go for the 3-game sweep. It'll be the UCF Knights in KU basketball's first opponent for the Big 12 tournament in 2025.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on? Derek Johnson here. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to the everydayers catching each and every episode of the show, wherever you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. On today's edition of LOJ, we're going to be previewing Kansas's first round game, I guess the second round of the Big 12 tournament, first game of the Big 12 tournament for KU. Taking on the UCF Knights in Kansas City. We'll get into what happened the first two matchups between these teams, the opponent's scouting report for the Knights coming into this one, keys to the game for KU, players to watch, and so much more on today's episode of the show, which is brought to you by TurboTax. Ready for stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed? Head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert because taxes are due here in, like a month, something like that. So, yeah, get your taxes done with TurboTax. All right, Kansas takes on UCF. This will be the late night game on Wednesday night. The Knights were able to easily dispose of the Utes of Utah, which, I think there's the plus minus to no matter who you played in this first round game if you're Kansas. The plus of playing UCF is you've beaten them 2 times. You've shown that you can, and in one of those cases, absolutely pasted them. You've shown that, you can beat this team. So go do it again. The downside is, tough to beat a team 3 times, right? Although you hear that all the time, I think the actual stats would prove out that the team who wins the third matchup most often is the team who won the first 2. But I don't know, maybe those numbers close in from where the first 2 were. Then you look at the Utah matchup, and it's like, okay, they would have been able to get revenge, and they just played such a bad game offensively. Would that have happened again? I don't know, especially closer to home. Then again, Utah, worst matchup. So there were the plus minuses to both. Either way, though, regardless of who you ended up playing, which, again, is going to be UCF, it's a game you should win, right? It's a game that if you want to make noise in the NCAA tournament, carry any momentum you gained from beating Arizona, this is the type of game you should win to move yourself on to that tougher matchup in the Big 12 tournament quarterfinals where the 3-seed Arizona is awaiting the winner of this game. But a late night game on Wednesday night for KU to determine if they can go there. And obviously after last year, that Wednesday game against Cincinnati, that was not a fun one. Kansas got paced in that one. That will certainly make this one a little bit more, I don't know, nerve-wracking, maybe is the term for it. But Kansas 2-0 against UCF this year, so trying to make it 3 straight against the Knights, who beat Kansas in Orlando a season ago. And for UCF, they're playing with their backs against the wall because they're probably in a position where they're sitting at 17-15 now. They had a really bad stretch in conference play where they were sitting at 13-7, 4-5 in conference play. They lost 6 straight games, including at Colorado and at Oklahoma State. If they win, in both of those games, and they'd be sitting at 18-13 right now, we might be having a better case about them, being an NCAA tournament team. Now, maybe if they won their way to the Big 12 championship game and then lost like Houston, at that point, I think they'd be like 20-16. Maybe that would be enough to get them back in, but most likely they're going to have to win the conference tournament if they want to make it to the NCAA tournament. So they are playing like a desperate team, which can always make them a more dangerous team. Now, you look at what happened in those first 2 meetings between these 2 teams. Kansas obliterated UCF in the first matchup, 99-48. Kansas got up early, and that was one of the most impressive games of the season for KU. Obviously, they had Shaquille Moore playing at a high level at that point in time for KU, but he is now injured and probably not going to be playing in this one. Floyd Badunga was awesome in that first matchup. I thought he was the best player on the floor. I don't know. Hard to argue with that because Hunter had 27 points in 23 minutes. He was unbelievable, but it was really everybody in that first matchup for KU. The defense was great. UCF wasn't making shots. KU was making shots. They were moving the ball well. Then you look at the second matchup, and that was a game that was in Allen Fieldhouse. You would think that would be the game more likely to be a blowout, but for Kansas, that was not their best performance. Didn't have a ton of effort, I would say, on the defensive end. And what's interesting for this one is you had no Dajuan Harris in that second matchup, but you did have KJ Adams coming back for his first game back, and he came off the bench and ended up making some key plays at the end there. KJ ended up with 12 points for the game. Zeke Mayo was huge, 24 points, 6 of 10 from 3. Oddly enough, only 2 of 10 on 2-point shots. Hunter was good again, 24 points in the home meeting. Flory was good again, 10 points, 11 rebounds in that home meeting. And then you got 12 points off the bench in the home meeting from Diggy Coy to really help to win it, because Kansas went 10 of 21 from three. UCF went bonkers from three in that game, 14 of 36, 39%, compared to 39 2-point shots, almost as many threes as they took twos in that game. And it was just a much different game that you had to pull out in the very end and really Jekyll and Hyde. Now, the one way to maybe view this is, okay, if that was like an A game from UCF, you probably saw their F game in the one in Orlando. Does that mean the most likely scenario here is you get a C game from UCF? And if you get a C game, do you just need a B game to move on, right? Like, maybe that is kind of the hope here if you are Kansas. Now, you look at UCF overall in the season, 17 and 15. They, after losing those 6 straight games, have now, won 4 of their last 6 games. And it hasn't come against any teams who are currently ranked in the top 50 in KenPom. They did lose to West Virginia, who's right outside of that, who's been having to deal with, some injury stuff so far this season. But the fact of the matter is they are starting to win a few more games to where, they're not in as bad of a rut as they were when they were losing those 6 consecutive games. And you look at the personnel on this team, they are dangerous because they have some players who can go off at a moment's notice. Keyshawn Hall, who we saw do that in Allen Fieldhouse. He had a really rough day at the office in the Orlando matchup, had an awesome day at the office in Allen Fieldhouse. 18.5 points per game, 7.1 rebounds per game, 2.4 assists per game this season. All-conference player for them, over 42% from the floor, almost 35% from three-point range. They've got a really good guard in Darius Johnson, 16.5 points, 4.2 assists, 2.4 steals. He's 41% from three. I think you saw the luxury of Dajuan Harris not being there in that second game to not, help defending a guy like that in the one in Allen Fieldhouse after he also, didn't have the best shooting performance in the first matchup. Jordan Ivy Curry, 13 points per game. He's mostly just kind of a scorer, hasn't been ultra efficient, a lot of 3-point shots, 33%, but he can get hot at a moment's notice. Mustafa Tiem is a freshman, over 7-foot big man who can shoot threes, who can shoot mid-range. He shot him really well in the Allen Fieldhouse meeting. Good shot blocker, 2.6 per game, 6 rebounds per game. So he makes things difficult a little bit for KU inside. And then you have some, role players, you would say, after that. Mikey Williams has played better over the second half of the season. Dallin Coleman gets them over 4 rebounds per game, but hasn't really shot well from 3-point range. J.J. Taylor and Benny Williams are guys that over the course of the season have contributed at different levels for them, though haven't played in every game, so I don't know the status of those guys coming into this. But, yeah, you look at it for UCF, and if Keyshawn Hall and Darius Johnson go off again, just like they did in that meeting in Allen Fieldhouse, it gives them a chance to, win games like this, and that does make them dangerous, and especially coming off their first-round matchup where they beat Utah, and Darius Johnson and Keyshawn Hall both had 20-plus points in the matchup, right? So you see the way for them to have that success, and Jordan Ivy Curry had a good game off the bench for the Knights as well. So, like I said, if they can get going from 3 and do it at a higher level, that's where they become dangerous. Now, you look at what they've done well over the course of the season where they've maybe struggled a little bit more. If we're looking at conference-only numbers, which I think is fair to do because that's been a huge sample of the season to this point in time, these numbers have not been updated since their win over Utah in the first game of the Big 12 tournament. So I don't know how much these will get adjusted, but they come in with the middle-of-the-pack offense, 8th of the 16 teams, at 15th on the defensive end. Fastest team in the Big 12, which is odd. We'll get to one of the keys to the game here, but they're the fastest team in the Big 12 in terms of possessions per game, basically. On the offensive end of the court, pretty solid at avoiding turnovers, middle of the pack in offensive rebound rate, getting to the free throw line, 3-point percentage, but they are kind of one of those more boom or bust teams where, it's either like really hot or really cold. They shoot free throws at a very high percentage when they get there. On the defensive end of the floor, middle of the pack in turnover rate defense. They've been pretty good at blocking shots and 3-point defense. And then where they've struggled on the offensive end, they're 14th of the 16 teams in the Big 12 in 2-point offense. They get their shots blocked a lot. They haven't had a lot of easy baskets necessarily at the rim for them. And then on the defensive end of the floor, this is the worst defensive rebounding team in Big 12 play. So if your Kansas get those offensive rebounds ready, that's a big reason why Flory Badunga was so good in both matchups, because he's a good offensive rebounder. So you wonder if he plays a little bit of a bigger role off the bench in this game after playing so well the first 2 meetings against the Knights. Also, they are 15th of the 16 teams in 2-point defense. is UCF. They don't get a ton of steals on the defensive end either. So, and they give up a decent amount of threes on that end of the floor. So where can KU exploit some of this? What are the keys to the game for the Jayhawks? Let's discuss that next on Locked On Jayhawks. This episode of LOJ is brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Continuing on our episode of Locked On Jayhawks, thanks for making it your first listen every day. Don't forget you can check out Locked On College Basketball this week. Highly recommend with all the college basketball conference tournaments going on, getting ready for the NCAA Tournament, which we're going to continue to hear from Kansas perspective, but maybe you want that national perspective. Maybe you want some help on figuring out who some of these other, small teams or big teams to watch out for when you're picking your bracket next week are, and do that with Locked On College Basketball this week. All right, keys to the game for KU against UCF round 3, this time in the Big 12 tournament over at the T-Mobile Center in Kansas City on Wednesday night. Number one is the turnover battle. So you look at the two matchups, I think this speaks, as you're looking at maybe the box score, I guess, between the two games that KU played against UCF, because they really are night and day. The only thing that would have made it crazier is if Kansas would have got blown out, I guess, in the second one. But from going from basically winning a game by 50 to having to make a couple late plays to winning a game, and that one being the home one, basically night and day in how those games went if you're KU. And so if you're looking at it from the perspective of what were some of the big differences in terms of that box score, when you played UCF, the turnover battle was one of those that it wasn't like a difference of 20 turnovers versus 2 or something like that, but it's enough of a difference that at least to me kind of sticks out here. So in the close loss for UCF, or I guess the close win, since we're approaching this from the Kansas perspective, the close win for Kansas, they only forced 7 UCF turnovers. In the big win, the blowout win for Kansas over UCF, they forced 14 UCF turnovers. That's double the amount, obviously. That's 7 more turnovers that you forced. But if you also look at it from a perspective of how many times you turned the ball over compared to how many you forced, in that first game that was played down in Orlando, Kansas wound up being +4 in the turnover battle. They had 4 less turnovers than UCF. They were +4, right? In the game that was played in Allen Fieldhouse, Kansas was -5. They had 5 more turnovers than UCF. That basically means there was a 9 turnover swing from the first matchup to the second matchup, right? Those points can add up. If you're giving 9 extra possessions to the opponent, obviously it doesn't make up, 50-point scoring swing. A lot of that had to do with the shooting numbers, very altering between the two teams, or maybe the quality of looks altering, or the 3-ball going down at a high rate for UCF. But those things can matter. And in a tournament setting like this, the last thing you want is to, give up those turnover opportunities. And if you win those turnover opportunities, gives you an opportunity to get to our second key to the game for KU, which is speed it up. Because UCF this season, I mentioned the stat earlier, they are number 1 in Big 12 only games in tempo, basically the amount of possessions they play per game. They're one of the fastest, one of the 20 fastest in the entire country. But UCF is only 1-9 this season in games where they play 76 or more possessions. 1-9. You compare that to the flip side, and I haven't seen the numbers from the Utah game yet, so I don't know what that one will get knocked into. But they're 15-6 when the games are played with less than 76 possessions. That is very odd that a team who plays fast is not played well when it's gotten too fast, right? And by the way, Kansas is 5-1 this season when they play 76 or more possessions. They've actually been good when they get to that tempo, and both of their wins over UCF are games that they played 76 or more possessions. And I think, too, when you think about this from a perspective of, it's not Allen Fieldhouse, but Kansas is going to have more home fans there than UCF Feel pretty confident saying that, right? And so if you're talking about getting the home fans involved, getting them active, getting them making noise, because it's going to be harder to, just in general, it's harder to, get the home fans to make noise and get active in the T-Mobile Center than it is in Allen Fieldhouse, right? Just in general, right? KU fans are still great. They're still going to travel. They're still going to make noise. But it's not the same. You know what it is. You know what's one way to get those fans going? Transition plays, going down, making those great plays where you're throwing dunks to KJ Adams or, getting big-time threes or layups and transition off steals. Those are the things that really get the crowd going. And if you can do that by forcing some turnovers, which we just kind of talked about, you look at UCF on the season, they are giving up 11.1 fast break points per game. That puts them in just the 19th percentile nationally. So, they haven't been that good this season in those fast break points. And that number, if you're looking at conference-only games, goes up to 11.3, which would put them in just the 16th percentile in terms of their transition defense. If you go to the last 10 games, UCF's up to 12.2 fast break points allowed per game. That puts them in just the 10th percentile nationally. So this has not been a great transition defense. You can take advantage of that a couple ways. But if you're Kansas, speed up this game. Get out in transition. Get those opportunities. All right, key number 3 for Kansas in this game is getting more looks at the rim and then making your floaters when you do have to settle a little bit further. So here's what I mean by this. I think in the second matchup, Kansas, and whether it was a doing of their own part or if it was something UCF was doing strategically, obviously having a big man who, is gigantic in the middle, which UCF has, who blocks a lot of shots, that's going to force teams to take shots further away, just in general, right? But if you're Kansas, can you figure out a way to get more of those shots at the rim? So UCF is 8-1 this season when holding teams to under 48% on 2-point shots. Now, what's interesting, the lone loss is that Allen Fieldhouse game against Kansas. That was the one time they lost where they held the team under 48% on twos. And what's the best avenue for UCF to try to hold Kansas to a low percentage on 2-point shots? It's preventing those shots at the rim because A, Kansas wants to get those, and B, those are the highest percentage shots that you can possibly get. You're right there. Make the shots, right? So what's interesting is Kansas actually shot better on at the rim shots in Allen Fieldhouse, even though the game was closer, than they did in the game in Orlando when they won by 50 points. Kansas shot 75% in the Allen Fieldhouse close win, 64% at the rim, and the blowout win. So what gives? The difference is the amount of shot attempts. In the home game, Kansas only attempted 16 shots at the rim. In the road game, Kansas attempted 42 shots at the rim. More than double, basically 2.5 times the amount of shots that they got at the rim. And again, those are your highest percentage shots, both in terms of KU's personnel and just in general, right? So you look at that, and then you also look at that in the home meeting when it was closer, you attempted 12 more shots in that paint area that is outside of 4.5 feet from the rim, but still in the paint. So those 5, 6, 7, 8 footers, the push shots, the floaters, the just inside the free throw line jumpers. 12 more of those attempts in the home game. And it's very easy to correlate the two and say, oh, you had less shots at the rim. You ended up settling for some of these other floaters instead of just taking it all the way to the rim. And the result was Kansas had a really bad game because Kansas has had some games where they actually shot well on those shots. But that game was not the case. Kansas was 5 for 22 on those shots in this game. And on the season, again, they're shooting 39% in that zone. That game was 22%. So it goes twofold. One, can you find a way to get back to, taking more of those shots at the rim where you get more opportunities? And two, when you do have to settle for those floaters, can you make them at a more normal clip to what you're doing, as opposed to what we saw in that second matchup when things were close in Allen Fieldhouse and you needed a big KJ Adams stop and you needed some big buckets late to win the game. We're going to finish up here. Players to watch for Kansas against UCF. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Our episode of the show today is brought to you by Factor Meals. Looking to optimize your nutrition this year, Factor makes eating well easy with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences every week, you can customize your meals to fit your lifestyle, whether it's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Plus, Factor even offers wholesome smoothies, breakfasts, and grab-and-go snacks to keep you fueled all day long. I love how Factor takes the stress out of meal planning That's always a big conversation with me and my wife. Like, oh, what do you want to do for dinner tonight? Oh, what do you want to do for dinner tomorrow night? Right? You don't have to worry about that. It's just like, oh, well, we have these choices from Factor. Boom, let's just pick a random one. Boom, that one. Easy to go. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/lockedoncollege50 off. That's lockedoncollege50 off to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. Let's go lockedoncollege50 off, all one word, lockedoncollege50 off at factormeals.com/lockedoncollege50 off to get 50% off plus free shipping off your first box with Factor. Thanks for joining us again on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. And don't forget, we'll have a postcast up late for you on your Wednesday night to talk about whatever happens between Kansas and UCF. And if they do win, we'll get you out a preview as well, talking a little of the KU-Arizona game at that point in time. If they lose, we'll have to start turning our head toward what's going to happen with the NCAA Tournament and all that jazz. But stick with us here on Locked On Jayhawks. Make sure you subscribe. Give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review if you can, anywhere you get your podcast platform. Certainly helps us on our end of things. All right, players to watch for Kansas against UCF. Let's start with the player matchup of the game. I think you can make a real argument. It's got to be Keyshawn Hall versus KJ Adams, right? Keyshawn Hall is probably UCF's best player. I mean, it's tough. Do you say Keyshawn Hall? Do you say Darius Johnson? But Keyshawn Hall is the team's leading scorer. He had that game over 30 points in Allen Fieldhouse. He was just kind of unstoppable. But for Kansas, they were able to defend him really well in Orlando. And KJ, as much as he did play a big minute total in his first game coming back in that game in Allen Fieldhouse, he came off the bench, right? Maybe you let him get into a bit of a rhythm. Whereas the game in Orlando, KJ was starting on him. So you wonder if him being there the full game and KJ's playing really good ball right now, if that'll be the difference in helping to slow him down a little bit more. He just had a good first Big 12 tournament game too against Utah, did Keyshawn Hall. But then what can you get from the offensive end from KJ? Can he keep up this offensive tear? And beyond that, against a bad defensive rebounding UCF team, can KJ keep up the rebounding numbers? He's been really good rebounding the ball over the last, 3 or 4 games. Can those things continue on? And I think that'll be a really good matchup. But I kind of think the most important matchup might be Darius Johnson versus Dajuan Harris, because we saw the impact of KU not having Dajuan Harris in that second matchup. The turnover numbers go up for KU. The forced turnovers go down for UCF, right? Dajuan Harris is one of your best, if not your best, at getting steals from the other team. And you look at a guy named Darius Johnson, who's a very efficient player, can shoot the 3 ball well. Having another defensive guard out there like Dajuan Harris can really help you mitigate that a little bit. And, it becomes really difficult if both Hall and Johnson are going off. If only one of them is going off, right, you can adjust your defense to one guy or the other. If both are going off, that becomes the problem. And so I think Kansas really missed Dajuan Harris in that first matchup, or in that second matchup. And Darius Johnson was really good. And so he's just been a good player. I think that'll be a really good matchup too. Now, high on the go-off meter to KU, I thought about putting Zeke Mayo here. He had a really good, performance in Allen Fieldhouse, making 6 threes, but the 2 balls just didn't go down. Didn't really have a big scoring effort, but filled up the stat sheet in the game in Orlando. Question mark for me, though, like, how is he going to perform? Because he's been so good at home. He's struggled on the road. What does this environment do for him in KU? So I'm leaving that one off for now. I'm going to go with Hunter Dickinson. 24 points in the first matchup, or 24 points in the second matchup. 27 points in the first matchup in 23 minutes. Unbelievable efficiency. So 25 points per game in the 2 meetings combined, with one with limited minutes. No need to overthink it here. Plus, he's coming off a really good performance last game. You heard from Bill Self talking about kind of challenging him to carry the team on his back. Well, carry him on his back. You're in a tournament setting now. Do that now. Plus, when you look at UCF giving up some of those kind of mid-range or short mid-range shots, he shot those at a high clip lately, made a lot of them against Arizona, and could have a fair amount of those opportunities against UCF as well, because if their center is just kind of guarding the rim, he'll be kind of left open for some of those opportunities. So we'll go with Hunter Dickinson for our high on the go-off meter for KU, and just not overthink it. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. We'll be back at you tomorrow night, late in the night, for a postcast episode of the KU UCF results. See you then. Make sure to subscribe to the show right here, anywhere you get your podcast, or on our YouTube page with Locked On Jayhawks.